Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. Thanks so much for joining me for the conversation. Today, I talked to another professor from the wonderful institution that is LaGuardia Community College in Long Island City, Queens. Her name is Nichole Shippen. She's in the political science department, and she's someone who studies race, studies gender, studies American politics, and is very articulate on all this stuff. Unlike me, I feel like I stumbled through a lot of the big questions in this conversation. But maybe that's just my own self-esteem and my own perception of hearing my own voice. But not in either case, Nichole Shippen is pretty brilliant on politics. She has quite a history coming from a small town in Wyoming. She eventually ends up on the East Coast in a graduate program at Rutgers. And, she talks a lot about class and race and identity and how these things kind of mingle together and sometimes, conflict with the environments we find ourselves in, whether it be Rutgers, whether it be Wyoming, whether it be CUNY, the many CUNY campuses that we've all, or some of us, inhabit as professors. But the conversation veered a lot towards race. We ended up talking a lot about Ferguson. It's been on my mind a lot. I think it's been on a lot of our minds over the entire summer. But the events that have followed the shooting of Michael Brown have been pretty remarkable for a lot of different ways. And there seems to be some sort of intuitive, maybe implied synergy between what's going on in Ferguson, the kind of uprising that's happening among people there, against police militarization, against the system that's kept this population in such a shitty position. But also, there seems to be a synergy with like the Occupy movement, and I don't know, I don't think, I don't feel like that's something that's happening in a concrete way, but I mean it in a kind of intuitive way. It feels like these strands, maybe this is how the 60s felt, it feels like these strands could and should come together. That there is some profit, if you'll excuse the word there, to be drawn from that synergy. So, it's exciting to see, in some sense, attention being paid to the problems that Ferguson is just one representative place. It's not just about the town of Ferguson. It's really about the way the entire system functions, and I mean that from in both a class way and a race way. And in all the other ways. And, we had, Nichole and I had a conversation that veered towards, history and the history of black people in the United States, and the idea of Afro Pessimism, something that I had never heard of. I was kind of blindsided by the idea, but that she brought up. But the idea of Afro Pessimism, I won't do it any service. I think you should Google it. And kind of look at that theory yourself, because it's pretty deeply theoretical stuff. But Nichole and I had a great conversation about race in America, and I'm a historian. I'm not really a theorist in a sense. Cultural theory definitely influences my work, and I think about that stuff, and its print is on my view of history. That's for sure. But at the same time, I when I look at Ferguson, I want to know, I want to place it, I want to contextualize it, I want to put it in on a larger continuum of the story of black people in America. I wonder, is it a turning point? And I know that's impossible to know while you're living through it. But we look now, and I teach the story of Emmett Till's murder quite often as this turning point moment. But you can't help but think that the people that lived through the murder of Emmett Till being in the news, this would have been in 1954. They didn't know what it was leading to. They didn't know what it meant that Emmett Till's body was on display and that it would have this kind of devastating visual impact around the world, and that it would lead to greater calls for civil rights in America. They didn't know that at the time, and that's why it's impossible for us to look at Ferguson and know where it's leading. But at the same time, it does feel like, and this is where I get into my hippy dippy shit, but it feels intuitively it feels like an important moment. Just like I think I do mention this in the interview with Nichole. the fact that Gaza has so much attention on it during the same summer, I think has a kind of poetic resonance, that there are a lot of foundational issues that lead to both situations and could be addressed in a far more substantive and fair way. And that's what I'm hoping is coming together, because I feel like the only way that happens is when people, however you constitute that, but people rise up in ways that are surprising and that, in retrospect we can see coming. And I guess that's what the job of the historian is. But in either case, I hope you enjoy this conversation. I tried to cover a lot of the stuff that Nichole is interested in. We also talked about her book, which is called Decolonizing Time, which I love the title of that. And she gives a lot more detail about what that book is about and what the idea is behind what she's exploring. And she's exploring the concept of time as really the main thing that's going on in terms of labor, in terms of how we think about labor, in terms of how we think about how we draw meaning from our lives. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Professor Nichole Shippen from the Political Science Department at LaGuardia Community College in Long Island City, Queens, and I hope you pick up more Nostalgia Trap. You can find it at all sorts of places now. I've been posting a few episodes on jacobinmag.com. You can also go to Stitcher.com and download an app and get the podcast that way. It's also on iTunes. The blog, nostalgiatrap.libsyn.com, has all of the episodes in various formats. And you can also go find Nostalgia Trap on Facebook. Like the page, and you'll get updates on new episodes and all sorts of other stuff. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. This is me and Professor Nichole Shippen. You're from Wyoming originally?
Yes.
Is that what town in Wyoming?
Riverton.
So that's I imagine a small town. I don't know
Yes.
if there are many huge towns in Wyoming.
No, it's a very, very small town.
Is it
maybe 9,000.
Are there cowboys there?
Yes.
Yes. So you come from Cowboy Town.
Sort of.
Ranchers.
We call them ranchers.
Ranchers.
Right.
Is that where you went to school, like growing up?
Yes.
What was that like? Do you ever go back there?
I do. I
Your
was just
family
back
there
there I go once a year usually.
Okay.
Yeah, my family lives in Casper, Wyoming.
So yeah, I guess I just want to trace how a person from an area like that
Right.
ends up being a political scientist in New York City. And the stops on that path better than I do.
Right.
But what was it like growing up there in terms of politics? Like how did politics enter your life? Were you someone that read the paper a lot when you were kids? Did your parents talk about politics in the house?
No, my family was completely apolitical.
Okay.
Wyoming, if you're around people that are not political,
Yeah.
the only politics that they have are usually about guns
Right.
and hunting.
Okay.
Really, so not like assault rifles, but like being able to hunt.
Uh-huh.
And other than that, like my dad cared about nature, like he cared about the land so that he could hunt. So
Right.
so it all revolved around that. So Wyoming was really, really boring. Just very. I grew up in a working class family.
Yeah.
My mom's Mexican.
Uh-huh.
My dad's white.
Okay.
And so having that experience,
Probably a lot of that in that area, actually.
yeah, well, not as much as you would think.
No?
But where I grew up in Riverton, the town is sort of, there's like the main town, which is like mostly white people.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's an Indian reservation,
Okay.
the Wind River Reservation.
Okay, so this is kind of a classic Western scene in my head.
Yeah. So, what's interesting is looking back, post education and like reflecting back on the situation that I was in growing up there.
Right.
Right. Because my mom's Mexican American and they were Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
So they felt more comfortable going to church on the reservation.
Interesting.
So the church on the reservation, which is called St. Stephen's, it, had all this Native American, like the elders would come in and do drumming. We'd go to powwows.
So this is like some syncretic kind of religion happening there.
Yeah, it was sort of like...
It was Catholicism, though, but
it was
Native
Catholicism,
American
but mixed with all this
yeah.
Native American like belief system, which is why like I'm probably not Catholic. Plus, I had the Mexican stuff mixed in there too. So it was like
I mean, this happens in Mexico too. Like this kind of mixture of like indigenous traditions with the Catholicism producing this kind of like I don't know, synthetic kind of thing. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that was happening in Wyoming too.
Yeah,
so
it was very strange. It's just like reflecting back on it, and I was teaching in Ohio for 3 years. And I tried to teach them, or I showed them a film, one of my favorite films called The Business of Fancy Dancing.
Right.
By Sherman Alexie.
Okay.
Right. And the kids just don't understand it. Because they've never known any Native Americans, at all. They couldn't relate to the experience. They had no idea what was going on, and the film
and that's probably true of most Americans, actually.
Maybe, yeah.
That they have very little experience directly with Native American populations.
And I grew up with them because a lot of my friends were Native American. They came to the high school in town, even though there was a high school on the reservation, I think because they had more opportunity. Yeah. And the sports teams,
So they had their own high school on the reservation, but many of them preferred to go to like a public school that you went to?
Yes.
Yeah. Looking back, is that kind of your first encounter with politics in that kind of way? That kind of like the intersection of ethnicity, race, politics, all that stuff?
Yeah, I would say so. The race politics were pretty prevalent now that you mention it.
Yeah.
I didn't think about it that way growing up. It was just sort of like, oh, there's these different groups of people. Like, like I had experiences where even though... I had this good friend, Lakrita, and she's Native American. And even though her parents like saw my mom and saw that she was Mexican, like they were still always very, very suspicious anytime I called on the phone. Oh. They would act like they didn't know who I was every time. Weird. And that was sort of normal. Yeah. And it sort of makes sense looking back now. But yeah. So that was like you were trying to make sense of that. And then also because I pass as like a white person, obviously with my last name and the color of my skin, lots and lots of racist things were said about Native Americans, mostly Native Americans because, it was just like a really
other white people feel safe saying that to you because they feel like, that's an experience that's come up on this show a few times is the weird kind of privilege of being either passing for white or being white is that you get to hear things. You get to hear things that perhaps people of color that appear as people of color would not be privy to. Right. You get to hear the what people really think, and people lean forward and kind of whisper to you this or that. And it certainly puts people that aren't racist in a strange position a lot because you're there hearing this and you're kind of asked to be brought into this conversation in some way, and it's horribly awkward.
And mostly my reactions were complete outrage. Like I would just say something, I would blow up, and then everybody would look at me like, "What the hell's your problem?"
Right. Right.
And then it was like
you do, just like you do know I'm not a white person, right?
But it's still like they didn't think they were saying anything offensive.
Yeah. That's people who say racist things don't like to be called racist. Like that's the classic meme right now. Like whenever a sentence starts with like I'm not a racist, but then that automatically a racist statement is going to follow that always. So how do you move out of Wyoming and where does your education really start? You said you went to Tacoma and where did you go to undergrad?
So I started at a community college actually in Wyoming. There's a whole backstory there I'm not going to go into, but I didn't really know what I was doing. I was first generation college student, so I didn't know the difference between a community college and like a 4-year university. Right. As silly as that may sound, like I really didn't have any concept. A lot of people don't, though. Yeah. So the community college was actually, I think, a really good experience for me. I think I would have been too alienated at a big school, too intimidated, and the community college gave me a year or so to sort of find my grounding, to be able to get involved in a lot of sort of like a literary magazine and the newspaper and all these leadership positions that I probably would have been too scared to sort of reach out for at a 4-year university. Yeah. And then from there, I transferred to University of Washington in Tacoma. It's a branch campus, which is now, which is at the time was a 2-year university, but like finishing school because there's lots of community colleges in Tacoma. Right. But now it's a 4-year, and it's supposed to end up bigger than the campus in Seattle. It's a beautiful campus. Okay, and
when you're starting going to school, did you have a major immediately, or how did you land on political science?
Yeah, so it's a strange story. So I wanted to get my PhD in English, and I met a professor who was teaching a male professor who was teaching a graduate course in feminist theory. Okay, and because I was an undergrad, I had to go ask permission to to be let into the course.
Right.
And instead of asking permission, I sort of was like, what makes you think as a man that you can teach feminist theory? And he really liked that. So he let me into the class. And so I was with all these,
Like you're already grasping the first tenets of this. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was let into the class, and he sort of became my life, and is still like my lifelong mentor. And he's still at the school.
What's his name?
Michael Foreman.
Michael Foreman.
Yeah.
And so it was a charismatic professor.
Right.
It seems to be like behind a lot of the stories of how professors ended up being professors is that they met someone along the way that kind of showed them. So what was, I guess I could start from the beginning in terms of what you do, because what is being a political scientist to you? Like what does that mean?
Right. So I don't call myself a political scientist
Okay.
because I think there's no such thing as science,
Right.
science of politics.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird term.
I'm a political theorist. That's what I'm trained in. So I would say for most people, I do philosophy, but not analytical philosophy, but like looking at thinkers who have thought about politics in a deeper way.
Okay.
So what's the meaning of freedom? What's the meaning of equality?
Right.
Sort of deeper
kinds of
analysis, sort of like Plato's allegory of the cave. That's usually where I
right.
start my classes. How do we see through the ideological BS.
It's critical thinking at the core of it. Yeah, about politics. And is it American politics that you focus on specifically? Or?
Well, so I'm at the community college level, which means I'm mostly teaching, requirements.
Right.
But in my classes, I still try to teach as much political theory as possible. So this year, I'm actually incorporating a lot more Latino politics into my courses.
Cool.
Because most of the students here are Latino.
Yeah.
So we'll be curious. It's sort of an experiment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does this how does political science get applied? Like, how do you see your role, kind of connected to the quote unquote real world? You know what I mean? Like, how does the theory connect with what's actually happening?
Right. So there is a connection. Most people split it into like, oh, you either do theory or you do practice. And it's always been really frustrating to me because I've always been a very practical minded person who did organizing. So I think I'm really, I'm kind of quoting Ruth Gilmore here because she came and did a talk here, but she was saying like education today is really like teaching students how to battle and how to survive. And so I guess I'm still struggling because I want so many of my students to be able to have financial security and happiness and all those things. But I don't necessarily want that at the individual level. I want this at the collective level.
Right.
So it's sort of teaching them like what's what, I guess. So they can negotiate the system better and smarter and sort of understand the world that they live in a little bit deeper.
And no, I know. And what's happened to them. I feel like, I don't know, in a weird way, I'm looking over at the picture of the oil company octopus over there on your calendar. And that world of whatever you want to call it, capitalism, consumerism, whatever American culture is, whatever Western culture is, whatever globalization is right now, I feel like there's a lot of disappointment that comes with being young and kind of transitioning into that adult world after college. I certainly felt that after college. I think I was one of those people that kind of swallowed the idea that if I got a 4-year degree, I would leave with a great job somewhere and a car and a house, and that stuff would come automatically. But it becomes a little more. Once those first crises come and you realize you're not going to get that job automatically. You start to it gets a little existential, and I feel like part of it's a weird way of putting it, but part of our jobs is like to prepare them to understand that process, if that makes sense.
Right. I think it's sort of a weird balancing act that I didn't really experience before teaching at 4-year universities.
Yeah.
Because, I taught at Rutgers. Those students are going to be fine. Like I just taught a class there this last summer. I'm not that concerned about their success in the world. They're already in a really good position.
And for the record, we're sitting in LaGuardia Community College right now, which is very, very different community of students and faculty, I would say, than at Rutgers, right?
Yeah. So the balancing act is how do you speak to students who have been born into a world of like economic crisis, recession, war. It's very depressing. And so
stop and frisk,
etc. And so I think it's useful insofar as teaching them how to think critically is not that difficult here at this school because they live it.
It's
part of their lived experience, right? And I think that's why I was attracted to theory in the first place. The first class I took in feminist theory, it was like a women's studies course at the community college in Wyoming, thank God, right? There was this old woman.
Women's studies courses in Wyoming.
Yeah, one. And I didn't even know what it was about. And I was just like, it's about women, I'll take it,
Cool.
I saw saw.
Did you have? Sorry to go back, but did you have sisters growing up? Were you like what was the experience of being around women, and how were you? Like, how did it become such an interest for you from being young?
So women, I would also say Wyoming. This is so terrible to say, but Wyoming, I experienced it as a very racist place, and also as a very sexist place.
Yeah.
So women, like, if they opened their mouth, like, people didn't really listen to them. At least the group. I mean, not all my male colleagues, like male friends I was very close with, of course, they listened to me.
Yeah.
But I'm saying in general, the experience of Wyoming was being silenced.
Right.
And so I took this women's studies course. It wasn't women and gender studies yet. And I really just saw, it sort of explained my whole world to me. It explained why my relationship between my mother and my father looked the way it did. It explained, it just introduced all these things. And I was like, now things make sense.
Yeah.
And it's no longer this like feeling of, either class shame or, it wasn't internal to me. It wasn't about me. It was about something outside of me.
Other people have noticed this too, and other people are writing about it. And to discover that there are books written about it is really comforting in some way. Like, this isn't just I
wouldn't say comforting. I would say empowering.
Empowering. Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess I tend to put it in like emo terms sometimes, of like feeling not so lonely. You know what I mean? Like,
the loneliness is still there though until until I got out of Wyoming and moved to,
I'm sure.
Where I could find, it takes a while. This is what I always tell young students today. I was like, when you're young, you kind of want to be friends with everybody and you try to be, and there's a lot of jerks out there. You get to an age where you're like, I can build my own community of like-minded people,
right? Where
I just don't have to put up with racist or sexist or nonsense anymore.
Yeah.
So,
and in that way, there's kind of a beyond getting rid of loneliness or building power. It's about building like community and solidarity and stuff, and that kind of stuff. Okay, so at I think we were talking about Rutgers. The political science there, is that where you got your PhD?
Yes.
Okay, so how did that program shape you as a thinker? I know that's kind of a big question.
Right. So I always sort of did interdisciplinary work until I got to a PhD program, which was straight up political science. Yeah. And so I was really shocked that the discipline was so conservative, and so apolitical, and so boring.
That's I've discovered this with history PhD. It's just and what's amazing is the history departments. I think in the political science departments both share this kind of like old staunch conservative old man kind of thing. That's difficult to negotiate. I think.
Yeah,
I mean, surprising actually.
But we had our it wasn't you did have your old school like sort of lefties, and those were the people I gravitated towards. Yeah. So, but the other part I would say is just, actually it started my formation into sort of the middle class world, or maybe the like lefty intellectual world, really started in Seattle. Okay. I was the foundation director for NARAL. The National what does it stand for? National Abortion Reproductive Rights Action League is what it used to stand for. Now they took abortion out of the name. But anyway,
that's politics.
I was introduced to a lot of young women from the East Coast who had been educated on the East Coast, had been raised on the East Coast. These women blew my mind. I had never met women like this, and just opened this whole other world to me. And so I really wanted to go to the East Coast and sort of see for myself.
When you say East Coast, what do you mean?
I mean, like, just like respecting someone who's well-read, respecting intellectuals, just not this superficial sort of like that I grew up with, what does it mean to be cool? Like, it means like you're a bookworm basically. And so, and also these young women, like, being introduced, that was, NARAL was sort of my first introduction to activism in some ways, going out to petition, it was really scary for me because I had never been a political person and had been silenced so much in my life. And even though it was Seattle and you think, oh, it's really safe and it's not a big deal, it was still terrifying because I was like, oh God, abortion's like such a horrible thing in my, in my mother's mind. Like, how are people going to react to this? But, so yeah. And I remember this episode where we all went out for sushi. I had never had sushi in my life. I didn't even know what it was about, but I didn't want to tell anybody. So I just sort of ordered something off the menu. It was just like raw fish. And I just sat there eating it being like, okay, just pretend it's not raw.
Pretend this is what you do.
Yeah. And then later I told them, I was like, I'd never actually experienced. And the group of women was actually interesting because it wasn't just East Coast women. It was also, there was one other woman who was the secretary there who was a working class woman from like, I think Idaho or somewhere. So she had kind of more in common with me in some ways than these other women. So they sort of mentored me in some ways.
It's this weird process of like civilization or something like that. But did you feel it that way? Did you feel like that you were evolving? Because I mean, or even like masquerading a bit as like a working class person among all these East Coast intellectual type people? Did it feel like something like you're apart from them? I don't know. I've always felt that way in some respect. I've always had like a real kind of affinity for that, like, I don't know, the New York literati. I think part of me came to New York because I wanted to be like with the McSweeney's people and like, you know, those kinds of people. And they were very different from where I came from. But at the same time, I felt like always that the working class identity is always going to be there. You know what I mean? And so how do you navigate that?
So I think the college system, in some ways, the way that I was educated sort of made me reject a lot of where I came from. And then, so now I'm in the process of like recovering a lot of that stuff, right? So like for a long time, like a lot of class shame, just trying to like fit in, be different, you know, like I remember when I first went
I eat sushi. I like sushi. I've always loved sushi.
Right. And now I struggle with like, now I'm so bourgeois. Like I love good food, you know, I love good coffee. I love good wine. And then I'm like, you know, so it's sort of, but I think,
has that caused any tension between you and your family?
Oh, of course.
That you're like this like hoity-toity.
No, that doesn't even,
better than everybody else. I think.
One time when I went home, I bought organic milk. This caused, you know, World War III. They were just like, oh, you think you're better than us? Like you don't drink regular milk, you know.
You don't drink factory poison like the rest of us?
And their point was, you know, you're just wasting money, basically. You're paying a higher price. And I was like, no, it's just about the taste. Like it tastes better to me. But now, you know, I came around. I'm just like, I don't fight with them anymore. I used to have these, you know, when I was younger, I was much more self-righteous. I wanted to have these battles with my families. And today I tell my students, don't even bother with your family. Go talk to your friends about politics. Forget about the family. Like it's just who you are in that family. You know, the power structure is just
there's too much tied up with it. Personally and otherwise. I just spent a few weeks at home at my parents' house, and you know, all that organic milk stuff, you know, weighs heavy on our minds as we negotiate living there for a few weeks. Do we buy milk that when there's already milk in the fridge? And my mom is like, there's already milk, why would you buy milk? And it's like, well, I don't want to say, you know, that, well, we like this milk better because we watched, you know, Food Inc. or whatever, you know. There is a kind of weird thing that happens when you kind of step out of your own class box. So you know, that must have been weird at Rutgers because you're kind of like surrounded by
that was the first time that I really experienced sort of like how working class I was. Although I met working class allies there, and that's probably why I made it all the way through grad school. I also met working class allies who were professors. Cool. And that's part of the reason I made it through grad school. But, you know, I mean, I liked everyone I went to grad school with. They were very nice people, very well-meaning, you know, good liberals for the most part. But having conversations with them about what was going on in my family at the time, they were like, oh, your family, you know, should probably be on Jerry Springer.
Oh, wow.
And not understanding how that was offensive. And not understanding that it's not just my family. There's millions of families like this. This is, you know, just because you don't know about it in your world doesn't mean...
And it's weird to hear that from people who are ostensibly like, you know, on the left or liberals, you know, that kind of like, you know, are supposed to be identifying strongly with that. But at the same time, you know, clearly repulsed by working class people at the same time.
I don't know, repulsed, but they just thought they were being funny, you know. They just and they were trying to lighten the mood. And it's like, you know, when you come from a working class family like mine, it's like one tragedy after another. So there are light moments, but it's between us. You know what I mean? Like you'd have to be in the context of the family. So
and you get defensive when it's about your own family too.
Oh yeah. Of course. Two big things that happened while I was in grad school. Actually, while I was taking my qualifying exams, where my younger sister got pregnant when she was 13. So there was that. And then about maybe 4 years ago now, my younger brother died of an accidental overdose.
Oh, Jesus, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So those were two really major things that were like sort of happening, you know.
While you were in grad school?
While I was in grad school, yeah. Both of those things happened before I finished my PhD. So I failed my qualifying exams the first time around, in part because my family was calling me, dealing with my sister's pregnancy, just freaking out. And then that's when I was like, you know what? I failed my qualifying exams. I need more distance from them, psychologically speaking. And I need to protect myself and my sanity and like my work. And it's not like I got rid of them. That's, but I did create boundaries that could protect myself a little bit more. Then when my brother died, those boundaries kind of broke down. So my brother's death sort of reconfigured the whole family relationships and actually made us all a lot closer, I think. We'll see if it reverts back to the old ways, but it really did change the family dynamic.
It's interesting when you mentioned your sister getting pregnant at a young age. How did that square with it? Must have been kind of trippy to think about. You had been a reproductive rights activist,
right?
How did that kind of bring that home to you?
Right. So it ties in because when my mother found out that I was working for NARAL, she was convinced, and I think she's still convinced to this day, that I've had an abortion. And that's the only way I could support this cause, because she raised me differently. We were Catholic. So I was really shocked that she told me that, because I had a friend who had an abortion and in undergrad, and she was like, oh, she did the right thing. But when it came to her own daughter, no. Right?
Yeah, right.
So I felt really angry that my mother didn't give my sister more options. And my sister's like 13 years old, so of course she's going to listen to my mother no matter what. And so it was really sad. And it was and my mother had me when she was 16. So sometimes there's like that cycle. It's
weird that idea of like, why would you support abortion activists if you hadn't had an abortion yourself? It's like unable to imagine empathy at all. You know what I mean? And I've got from my own parents, when especially in college, when I was really concerned with gay rights, and I talked about it a lot, and my parents were like, he must be gay. Then they're freaking out. And like, then that led to me to having this awkward thing of like denying that, I'm gay, which is something a conversation you don't want to have ever with anyone, with your parents especially. But it was like, they couldn't imagine that I would just, for no reason, like, why would you support gay rights if you weren't gay yourself? It's almost like, why would you support the civil rights movement if you're not black? Right. Which is an insane proposition to think about when you're thinking about politics.
But I think that's I think the difference between the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement is really this identity politics. And I've always said that's kind of problematic. That's why a lot of people don't want to support gay rights, because then it immediately, the idea is you will only support something if somehow you are a part of it. Right. And then that sort of erases any sense of solidarity across difference.
Well, that's kind of the story we tell. I mean, I do U.S. history about the 60s and 70s, and particularly around like the GI movement, but around movements, all sorts of social and political movements of that era. And that's kind of the story of the 60s, right? Is that it all fell apart into identity politics, and that people kind of branched off into their own camps. And we lost the kind of like bigger thing. So are you one of these people that's like class above all? Like
no.
Where are you at with the identity politics thing? Because I find it really tricky to talk about, especially as a white guy.
I feel like one book by a historian, Ruth Rosen, The World Split Open. I really like her account of the feminist movement.
She was married to Todd Gitlin, actually.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she's a classic Berkeley second wave feminist, right?
Yeah. So I really liked what she had to say, insofar as, and she's talking about second wave feminism, insofar as she's like, look, identity politics happened for a reason. Women left these other movements they were part of because the movements were so sexist, and the women are like, what the hell am I fighting for if you're not in solidarity with me? So that sort of makes sense to me. So I think identity politics was a necessary step. Now you come to Occupy Wall Street, then people are like trying to get back together. They're like, let's have some coalition, but it's all about coalition building, like how do we make a mass movement again? So I think it's not that identity politics is to blame. I think that was a necessary step. Do I think class is above all? Again, my strongest identification is working class, so I do take class pretty seriously. Right. But I think it's much more complicated than that. So I guess.
Well, it's tricky because it's come up in the conversation right now around Ferguson, right? Is the kind of like, whose movement is this? Like, what's going on, and whose movement is this? And why are white people there? White people shouldn't be showing up to show their support, because I don't know.
Who says that?
Have you heard this outside agitators meme? It's like and quite a few liberals are throwing it around, the idea that white people, particularly like white leftists, Occupy Wall Street types, communist socialists, are coming into Ferguson to try to co-opt the movement and try to
To what end?
to make their revolution,
Okay.
and like to make their and it's just bizarre to me because in the history of these movements, and in particular like the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, solidarity with white leftists was pretty important, in a lot of in moving things forward. And I know it's tricky territory, but
So I'm reading this memoir right now because I'm going to be on a panel next weekend. This is a memoir by Frank B. Wilderson III, African-American guy, grew up in Minneapolis.
Incognito, a memoir of exile and apartheid.
Yeah, and it's a very, very good book. But he sort of talks about it because he went to South Africa to sort of fight against apartheid, and no one ever really trusted him, even though he was black. He wasn't South African, and he also talks about like white people and it's just really, the more I think about Orange is the New Black, and I think about this, he writes within this genre called Afro Pessimism, which I just sort of learned about.
Afro Pessimism.
Afro Pessimism, and it has to do with, Hegel's master-slave dialectic.
Sure.
Hegel's master-slave dialectic is all about human beings trying to get reciprocity from other human beings. And the Afro Pessimism, the pessimistic part, is that perhaps reciprocity is simply not possible between blacks and whites because blacks have historically always represented the other that sort of shapes whiteness. So I'm taking that more seriously now, and just sort of his politics are, I would say, more radical than mine are. But he's kind of, his politics are really appealing to me, especially in light of all these innocent young men being murdered. It's outrageous.
I agree. I mean, for me, it's like, I don't know, when I see things like Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, the big cases that have happened in the last few years, it's just, for me, I guess because I'm a historian, particularly of the 20th century, the black body in American life and the brown body in American life has been, considerably more disposable than the white body.
Absolutely.
And when I hear that term Afro-pessimism, it makes me curious. Like, I think I might be an Afro-pessimist in that sense in the way I read it, because I'm always kind of, it's heavy. I think, the race relations, I think I have a very, very dark vision of what it is in America. And I know that kind of disturbs the liberal imagination in a lot of ways. But what's the end of that with Afro-pessimism? In terms of, you said he's more radical than you are. What do you mean by that? Like, what is his solution, or what is he seeing as the end point of that?
Right. So he basically says something in the book, and I quoted it on Facebook the other day, that we should not cathedralize. That's his word. Pacifism. That it's not a principle. It's a political strategy. And so he's like. So so how is he more radical? I think probably he supports more radical tactics like armed resistance.
Right.
You know, I mean, when you're being gunned down in the street and you are innocent and you're not even carrying a weapon. Yeah. What is
the option?
What is, so so I'm rethinking.
And we're back to the big questions of the civil rights movement and how it split apart, is kind of like, are we headed for an armed revolution in this country? Is that something that's even something we can even imagine, considering in particular, like how armed the state is at this point, it seems like a recipe for a lot of disaster. So are you more, are you more like on the nonviolent end of things when you think about that?
I used to be. Yeah. And now I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. It's hard because, when I watch like, I don't know if you've seen like Eyes on the Prize or like, you see that nonviolence as a strategy working. You know what I mean? You see it like really working. But then when you also like, when you get closer to it, you see in ways that it didn't work, and you see ways that it couldn't have kept going in this, and that it worked because of a very specific context of the segregation that was happening in the South. Right. I think in the civil rights, any social movement, actually, you always have the more radical element that I think makes the more moderate element, even though Martin Luther King was considered a radical and all this, makes it seem more acceptable. And, King actually puts that in his letter from Birmingham jail, right? He says, if you don't accept this nonviolent approach, then here's the alternative black nationalism with like Malcolm X, you know? So, but I think they were speaking to two different audiences. Like Malcolm X, obviously is speaking to the more working class, the more urban. Yeah. They're totally different characters. So I think they're not two separate things. So I don't know what it would look like. I don't. I mean, it's funny, all those different and all very, very male swaggering characters of the civil rights movement. Like we talk about. Bobby Seale and Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and Martin Luther King, they're all kind of like different types of men. it feels like, you mentioned Orange is the New Black. If there is to be like a new civil rights movement, and it seems like that's appropriate, right? And maybe a different one, a more advanced one, a more sophisticated one. Where do you see women in that movement? Like, what is your kind of feminist take on all of this stuff? Because it seems like feminism is a big part of shaping like your own kind of political outlook.
Right. So, right now I'm thinking about, because I've been reading this memoir, I'm thinking about the movie on Mandela, right? And they don't really feature Winnie Mandela, but she features pretty prominently in this book. And she was obviously more radical and like kind of, got screwed over.
Yeah.
So I think telling those stories of these, women revolutionaries, and here on campus, I'm faculty mentor for People Power LaGuardia.
Yeah.
They organize like let's talk about the revolutionary women. Let's highlight them. Let's highlight their histories. But you don't see movies made about them.
Yeah.
So it's frustrating. It's really frustrating. And so that's why I was thinking seriously about this book, because they're basically saying representation of blacks is simply not possible. It's always about whites. It's always about the white audience, and I think we have to take that more seriously. And, I've had, here at LaGuardia, white students are the minority. But whenever I teach even about the civil rights movement, which you think everybody just sort of accepts, I always have some disgruntled white male student who's sending me like angry emails after class because he thinks students are looking at him and blaming him for everything.
Really?
And and it's weird.
Personally.
So it's like, that's really frustrating. And so I think, I saw Frank B. Wilderson speak at the Gramsci Monument that was up in the Bronx. It was the last day before they tore it down. And he said he realized when he had a son that he could, he realized this sort of pessimistic, point of view, because he said, I can't protect my son because I can't protect myself. And it was so depressing.
Yes.
And I don't think I had really, so I feel like I'm going into a deeper understanding, like more depths, but it's more depressing.
Yeah.
And it sort of moves us further and further away. He was a professor in California at several colleges as an adjunct, and again, sort of disrupting the liberal imagination that like, oh, everything's fair and, meritocratic. And like, if everyone just like does the right thing, then everything turns out okay. And it's like, no, it's way more messed up than we think it is. Yeah.
Well, the culture tends to send you a message that everything's okay, despite the fact that there's like, they're kind of like, also exploiting, the kind of wildness of the story of what's going on. Because I mean, I barely watch mainstream media at all, but since I was home this summer, my parents have the TV on a lot, and I was able to see CNN's coverage of Ferguson, and it's just so depressing in the way that it's presented, in the way it's boiled down to, they have it boiled down to basically, buzzwords, and that they're even using like, I don't know if you've noticed this connection, but they're using the words human shields to say like that the protesters are most of the protesters are good, but there are bottles being thrown from the crowd, like, and I'm just imagining rockets, and the police officers don't know where those bottles are coming from, so we have to treat everybody as if they're throwing bottles, and it's just amazing that like a water bottle hitting a soldier, basically a police officer dressed as a soldier, I should say. It then kind of is greeted with this like disproportionate, insane military response.
Yeah.
Like, how do you talk to your students about stuff like that? Because they're I feel like, not that they're just like complete robots of the mainstream media, but at the same time that our job is, as you've put it, is to kind of like teach them how to see through that stuff. So where do you even begin? Are you going to talk to your students about Ferguson?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that they already get it. They grew up getting it.
Yeah.
Like their parents, if they're a kid of color, especially a black male, their parents have already instructed them
about the police.
Yeah. This is not
That's just a fact
this is
of
not
life.
news to them. Yeah. So I think the bigger problems I've had in class is sometimes trying to create solidarity across racial groups, people infighting.
Yeah.
Like when I talk about the question of poverty, like who's responsible for poverty, they're just like, all they want to talk about is people they know who are cheating the welfare system. And I'm like, this is exactly what the establishment wants you to talk about and focus on.
Yeah.
Blame individuals. It's not a structural problem. It's just ridiculous. So, I don't know if I get through to them. So I'm still, teaching is experimenting. It's sort of like what works, what doesn't work.
Well, even if you don't get through, you plant a seed, right? And like
that's what they say.
Yeah,
I don't know.
and like maybe in another class in 2 semesters they recall something from your class and connect it to what they're looking at. I mean, that's at least how I like to think about it.
I mean,
the evolution. It's an evolution. It doesn't happen overnight.
Right. I think it's still frustrating. I'll have conversations with them about doesn't matter who's standing up in front of you in the classroom.
Yeah.
Like obviously I look and pass as a white person. My last name's Shippen. It's not Trujillo. And they're like, oh no, it doesn't matter. It's like, no, of course it matters.
Yeah,
Let's talk about why it matters.
Yeah.
What is, I said the first time I went to college, I had my first African-American professor, a female professor. I had never even like really known African Americans at all, and because they just weren't in Wyoming really. There was one person I grew up with who was half black, and the images you would have seen on TV about black women wouldn't have been them as professors. Right, and so I spent a long time because I met the first sort of powerful black. Or sort of people of color I met were black women, and I kept wanting my mom to be more like a black woman, because I still didn't see role models of Mexican women in positions of power.
Right.
And right now I'm like 37 years old. I'm taking a seminar called Bridging Historias that's teaching me the history of Mexicans and Latinos that I was never taught.
Yeah.
It was never even an option.
Yeah. And
as far as I can remember. So it's like I'm just now learning my own history.
A personal trajectory that you didn't even know.
Yeah. So and so I think I was thinking about this on the way to work today. So much of my history was sort of taken away from me because it was starting with my grandmother. She was forced to sort of speak English, and so they didn't raise us to think that being bilingual was a positive thing.
Right.
And then the rest was taken away because people just don't see me as biracial. But that doesn't erase like the internal struggle that I have constantly that I feel like is not as intense as say James Baldwin or Frank B. Wilderson, but nevertheless I have a struggle when I date white people or when I date people of color because I'm both. Like I can't separate out those two things.
Yeah.
And yet my Mexican part is not visible at all in name or in speech. I don't speak Spanish fluently. So it's really it's like really frustrating.
Well, and then you add the class identity on part of that too,
right?
And then you're at Rutgers with a working class identity, and it seems like those conflicts are basically your identity are those conflicts in a sense. Like it's a conflicted identity as a total thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, but I have met. At least one friend in Ohio. When I taught in Ohio for 3 years, which is a whole other experience, I want to tell you about it because I was teaching women and gender studies courses to business students. This school is mostly white kids who grew up in all white suburbs outside of major cities. So they've never interacted with people of color. They've never thought about racism. They've never.
And this is women and gender studies?
Women and gender studies, but It was the business students who were forced to decide between women and gender studies or African American studies. And our joke at the school, which I probably shouldn't say, but our joke was that the students would be thinking about these two classes and be like, angry black woman or angry dyke.
Right.
And they felt less afraid of angry lesbian, right? So that was sort of the joke. And I would talk to the students about that and they would admit, that's why they're really afraid of black women. So, whatever, like I still talked about race and racism in the class.
Right.
But I think that experience really made me think about, I know it sounds cheesy, but like meeting students where they are. Yeah. Because these kids, like, they really had to take a leap of faith that what I was saying, I wasn't just making up because they'd never experienced it. Yeah. Here at LaGuardia, totally different, right? The students are living it so that I don't have to explain race. I don't have to convince them that racism exists. Yeah. So
they're living it already. So did you get through to them? Some
of them,
Some of them
come
up to you and say like, I've never experienced this before. Because I say that because I teach at Brook. I don't know if you know that, but Brook is a business school, and it's like I've been teaching U.S. history and with a very heavy kind of like critical race theory kind of like take on U.S. history for years now, and it's all business students, and like they clearly have not really come to this material before, and some of them react in a very excited way about it. Some of them are just like really like, wow, I never really thought about this before. Even I don't know, just the business students that are going into marketing and management, they have not thought about that history, and some of them really like it, and others are silent about it. But it's kind of something they have to go through because it's part of their general education requirement. Right. Did you meet any hostility from business students?
Well, they really liked me, thankfully,
thank God,
because I'm funny. But I definitely had people having like meltdowns. Yeah. When they basically raising their consciousness and them just being like, I can't be happy now after taking your class. And I'm like,
it's depressing.
This is really not the point.
The
it's not
is too depressing.
About you. Like, it's about do something about it,
Yeah.
So that's why when people say I'm not a racist, that's bullshit. We're all racist. We live in a racist country.
Yeah.
The only way you can transform that is by changing the conditions. So it's not about individuals.
So how are we going to change those conditions? Because we're in the midst of a summer that saw the Eric Garner thing here in New York, and militarization of police is certainly on the national docket all of a sudden, which is interesting to me. It seems like the libertarians are going to try to capitalize on that. I don't know if you heard Rand Paul, but he's like all over the Ferguson thing.
What is he saying? What's his
basically take? That that libertarians have been concerned about the militarization of police for a long time, and it's time to for a national conversation about that. And what's people on the left are like, he's right, but I'm also horrified by the idea of Rand Paul having a voice anywhere in politics. So. Yeah, I don't know. We're at a weird moment with that stuff. Where are you at with Ferguson? Like, how are you kind of framing it? And when you talk to your students, how are you going to frame it to them?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's
how big of a flashpoint is this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty big flashpoint because the events that came, the murders that came before this, right? So it's so blatant. It's so in your face.
Yeah.
That.
It's kind of amazing because, I come from, the LA riots were a big part of my childhood because I was living in Ventura, which is not far from LA. And of course, Ventura is a conservative white town filled with conservative whites that started shaking in their boots about the blacks are coming, up the coast. You start getting these fantasies of like, oh, the black hordes are coming to kill us all, which is kind of interesting. It sounds like a Indian raid type fears that
I think
still
it comes
trickling
from,
down.
The first time I saw Birth of a Nation.
Yeah,
is that the movie?
Yeah.
And there's an interview of Spike Lee talking about that movie.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever read it, where he's saying, they teach it because it had all this new cinematic techniques or whatever, but they never talked about the racial content of what the film was about. And the first time I saw that film, I was like, wow, white people are really terrified of black people.
Yeah.
That's what that movie's about. The KKK is like coming in, like saving everybody.
Saving specifically white women from rape by black males.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's actually pretty incredible.
So I think it's not that surprising. I think, and actually he has this line, again, Frank B. Wilderson has this line in his book where he says, there used to be this saying, I think the KKK said it, and I might be misquoting it, but something like, for white people, like black people are always on their mind, and he also has a line where he says white people, he wrote a letter to like the faculty where he worked, where he said, white people are guilty until proven innocent. So sort of reversing really rethinking the way that our brains have been programmed.
Yeah. That's why I think classes like yours, I'm sure, tend to like blow people's minds, because it's like it's a big reversal. You're basically shown like that everything you believe is wrong.
Yeah.
And then actually we're living in a much more racist situation than anyone on the white side really perceives. It's like you have to be shown it, and it's weird because it's like there's this middle class thing of like middle class liberal thing of we watch these movies like The Help and all these types of movies that basically
are movies for white people
that weep over how sad it is that racism existed in the past.
Yeah, but it's more like in The Help, amazing. It's like white people are helping black people. Yeah. Like they're the savior, of course, every time.
They are the help. Yeah.
So I mean, again, those movies are about making white people feel better about themselves.
Right.
I'd like to teach a class in the politics of comedy. That's why I'm doing this panel on Orange is the New Black. But I think that these comedies, there is so much racial tension in the United States.
Yeah.
There's so much racial tension in the classroom, and no one wants to talk about it.
Yeah.
Like I brought it up at a diversity, celebration or, workshop here at LaGuardia, and everybody's like, the white people, I should say.
Yeah.
The people of color were completely silent because they were like, what is she talking about?
Right.
But the white people were very resistant to it. They were just like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And I was like, hello, do you live in the same city as me? Do you teach at the same school as me? Do you not? And then, it was sort of implied that I was creating this racial tension in the classroom.
Oh, boy.
And it's like, I don't have to create it.
Yeah, it's here.
It's here, and we should talk about it, and we should make it visible.
Some of our students are being stopped and frisked, and others are not.
Yeah,
you know what
exactly.
I mean? And like that's pretty heavy.
Yeah.
Like to be on your way to school and to be, basically, kidnapped for a second by the NYPD and be humiliated, and then to just go to school and realize that that happened to you because of the color of your skin, would make me see other students and faculty in a very different light. And I think that people that don't have that experience, have a difficult time really understanding that. And it always comes back to like that thing of like being able to see through other people's eyes.
Right.
And for me, like, critical thinking is about empathy in a lot of ways, but it's hard to teach that.
But it's so, again, I go back to Hegel because I think about that master-slave dialectic, that struggle. He calls it a life and death struggle for reciprocity.
Right.
Why is it a life and death struggle? Because it's very, very hard to see someone else's humanity as they constitute it, not as you want them to constitute it. Right. And so, again, I think with these Afro pessimists, they're saying maybe that's just not possible. Maybe you can't see through someone else's eyes.
Yeah.
And maybe that should be our starting point.
Oh, that's tough.
Right? I mean, it's a lot tougher position.
Because
and what are the politics out of it?
Well, that's identity politics in a lot of ways, right? That brings you back in a sense, because it's like, well, if there are these walls, if there are these barriers of understanding between whites and blacks, then where do we start? Because if I'm never going to be able to understand the black experience, and I feel like that's true, I feel like I can get to it in a lot of different ways, and I can, imagine it, but I can never really be it or live it.
I think the problem will be solved because they keep talking about this on NPR, how whites are going to be the minority sooner than we think.
Yeah.
And I think we should, I think we
should encourage
lots of things are going to change at that point.
Well, I mean, it's weird, but
I don't know about the center of the country.
But what about the South African thing? Because it's like, like Louis C.K. has this great bit about how whites will, talk about minorities, even if there are more of them. Like a white person will go to Africa and be standing, as the only white person in a crowd of 1,000 blacks and be like, look at all these minorities. Isn't it amazing that there are so many minorities here? And it's this kind of like, I don't know, very, very deeply ingrained psychological, ideological thing that's basically just welded into the white imagination of the kind of like, well, white people are the normal, and then anything outside of that is a minority. It has nothing to do with numbers in a weird way, if that makes sense. There's kind of like this just straight racial purity that has little to do with how many of them there are. But it's funny because that's the main anxiety I hear from people in my family who won't be mentioned about what's going on in California. Is that they meant the starting point of the conversation is always whites aren't going to be the majority anymore. Whites aren't going to be the majority anymore. We're not the majority anymore. Uh-huh. It's like, what are you saying? Like, what does that mean? Is it just a numerical thing, or what is the anxiety at the bottom of that?
Right.
Like, is that like an expression of like we're not going to have the privilege that we've had anymore? It's like really like an admission of something.
But that's the thing. Like our pleasure. Something else that comes from Frank B. Wilderson, but I've thought about it a lot. Like our pleasure, our leisure, all this stuff comes from the suffering of other people who don't have those things. Right. And that's a contradiction within capitalism that we can't resolve within capitalism. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so that's why I have a really hard time, if I ever interact with people who work on Wall Street. It's like, it seems like they don't even have a conscience. Yeah. It's like, how can you...
Well,
how can you live with these contradictions? Yeah. How? Yeah. Without trying to resolve them in some way. Yeah. It's just like, I can't, I went and saw what's that movie, Guardians of the Galaxy? Yeah. And I was sitting there just thinking, like, right now I'm watching pretend people be blown up, but real people are being blown up in Palestine. Yeah. I know. And they were showing these horrible images of the children with their heads half blown off, and it's really, really depressing.
Yes, it is. It's surreal, actually. Watching that this summer, what's bizarre is the technology we have just to videotape everything. I mean, I brought up the LA riots because they videotaped Rodney King being beaten, and that, like, the fact that there was a videotape of what had been happening every day, basically, was so shocking to Americans to see. But this summer, Eric Garner is choked to death. Mm-hmm. Like, literally on video. I haven't even watched it. I don't want to watch it. Mm-hmm. For some reason, I can't. Police brutality videos, the ones that just boil my blood. But we have a guy being killed, like, literally on camera, and it's all kind of greeted in a ho-hum way. Like Rodney King's beating, that video was shown over and over and over. It was like a big deal. But now it's like people are killed on camera by the police. regularly. And it's just kind of like, well, another person was killed on camera by the police. It seems like that can't last. It seems like we're going to reach a terminal point where the public is just going to not take this anymore. I could be wrong. I did want to talk about a couple more things with you before we're out of time here. I know we talked about race a lot, and I know that's a big part of what you do, but you have a book coming out that's about time. What is it? What is your thing? What is your thing with time? That sounds like something a quantum physicist should be writing about. So how does a political scientist, a political theorist, approach the idea of time? So I love the concept.
Right. So this was my dissertation, and it was basically focused on the labor movement's fight for time. In other words, the reducing the workday to 10 hours, which Marx says took 30 years to accomplish, by the way, in England, 30 years to accomplish that. And
30 years for a couple hours.
Yeah. And so anyway, that was my starting point. My starting point was my family and how much they worked and how hard they worked and how they never got anywhere.
Yeah.
And so going to college, like I was like, I better do something that I like because I'm going to be working all the time. Like that's what I'm going to do, So it was sort of always in the back of my mind. So basically my book is a work of political theory and critical theory. And I'm just looking at these different thinkers, starting with Aristotle's conception of leisure and like, what is leisure? It's not, it's a deeper understanding of leisure than just simply license, just doing whatever I want. Right. And then sort of thinking about using leisure as a regulative ideal to sort of criticize how overworked we are and, how work is kind of, lots of people are writing about this now. They weren't writing about it when I started. But I think after the economic recession happened and there's just not enough work to go around, now a lot of people are talking about like, let's just work less.
Yeah.
And I would...
But if work is the only path to economic stability, then what does that mean for people that are out of work?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the universal healthcare helps a lot because now we're not as tied to work. So I don't know what the future will bring. It's really hard. And people who write about this say it's like, oh, it's different in terms of culture. And it's like, yeah, I really wish Americans would fight more for leisure, for free time, that would be a political demand that they prioritized for all of us, But again, I don't want to have leisure when other people are like, working night and day to make ends meet. Like that doesn't make me feel good. That makes me feel horrible.
Yeah.
And Andre Gors talks about, splitting the economy into a dual economy, those who have access to full-time employment, and then the rest, the people who serve them. And the service sector. So it's very
it's tricky. It reminds me of when I read about what you were writing about. It made me think of one of the first big political moments for me in terms of radicalization was I think watching this documentary about Noam Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent, and Chomsky at the end of it, I think he's kind of conceiving of like he's kind of giving his whole theories about the working class and his politics, and he says that people should not have to rent out their lives so that they can eat and have shelter and have the basic needs met. They shouldn't have to rent their lives out, and that seems like where we're at, right? Like we accept that.
I think that's how capitalism functions. Like you sell your labor and not much else is left over at the end of the day, and it's really sad. That's why I wanted to become a professor, because I actually had control over my time. Now working here, my time is now being taken away a lot more than I thought it would be with, because you have to do all these contributions.
Administrative work
administrative stuff. So, it's like I actually don't have too much time to even do research.
But then you feel guilty because you're like, well, I'm not like digging a ditch somewhere or building a luxury hotel in Dubai, working 16 hours a day for doing factory work that's going to kill me. So it's a weird contradiction or a paradox or whatever.
But I think framing it in that way, this idea like I'm so lucky, I really shouldn't complain about anything, which I know you're not framing it like that exactly. But I think I think it's a trap. Yeah, I think it should be more like we need to fight. That's why Marx said workers of the world unite. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Because capital can move any place it wants and screw over the new group of people there.
Right.
And again, it's tied to us, right? We have iPhones, and I'm sure everyone's heard about this. The workers in China who were like committing suicide because they're working in factory conditions, so much so that they made nets around the building,
which is just an insanely macabre idea.
Right. When I looked into it, though, probably the reason they were committing suicide was could be in part the horrible working conditions, but their parents would receive a check for a certain amount of money, and maybe they did it as a sacrifice to their parents. I don't know. But yeah, I looked into that as I was writing the book.
Holy
But,
fuck.
you know, a good story in the book, because everyone was like, well, what are, you know, there are all these alternative understandings of time. And it's like, yeah, that's nice, but they're not institutionalized.
Yeah.
So they don't really have a lot of power. But if you heard about this story in Queens, I think it was in Flushing, these Korean elderly men were having coffee at McDonald's
I
for
did hear
like
about this.
hours
Yes.
on end.
Yes.
And they were like in a war with McDonald's. McDonald's like, you can't sit here all day.
They
and
bought like one coffee
and they would
or
sit
like
there all
one
day
side
long.
of fries. Yeah. Yeah.
And I love these guys. They were like my heroes, you
Yeah.
know? It's like, yeah, screw McDonald's, because McDonald's is fast food. Like the
Yes.
whole idea is you get in, you get out. Like
Right.
you eat really fast. And here these guys are just like, we're taking our time. We don't work. We're like leisurely. We're retired. And
Well,
I thought this was a beautiful
especially in
moment.
America, people that quote unquote like aren't doing anything,
Right.
you know, it's just like that's like beyond the pale. Like the
Yeah.
idea of doing nothing is just insane. Even on vacation, we're supposed to be doing.
Right.
And yeah, the technology like this is supposed to, you know, liberate us from that.
Right.
But technology rests on an infrastructure that requires tons of workers, tons of mainly like low wage workers. And also, you know, I don't know if you've noticed this, but you know, you carry a smartphone around. Now you got your job with you everywhere you go.
Mm-hmm.
There's like very little barrier between like work and leisure.
Right.
Like the Knights of Labor, when they were fighting for the 8-hour day in the middle of the 19th century, their conception was like there were 24 hours a day and you have 8 hours of work, 8 hours of leisure, and 8 hours of rest,
Right.
you know, sleeping. But even that seems like too much to me. Like,
Yeah.
how do you? I know this is kind of like a utopic idea, but like, how do you conceive of what we should be doing with our time in an industrial society?
Yeah. What should we be doing with our time?
Yeah,
I think we
Like, how
should
does it-
obviously be fighting injustices. Like part of our time should be devoted to that. But
Yeah.
again, because we're all overworked, it becomes very hard to be politically active because
Yeah.
it takes time, you know, to go to these rallies or become sort of committed. But I also,
even to
you know,
educate yourself, it takes time to
Oh, yeah,
read about
yeah.
what's going on and find out about what's going on.
Yeah.
Especially when the culture's just screaming at you to not care about anything.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know what we should be doing with our time. It would be nice if we had the institutional, you know, reduction of work to say,
Yeah.
I don't know, 6 hours a day
Yeah,
or less.
yeah.
And then I think that my argument in the book is that then our imagination could be enlarged about what we want to do with our time. Right now, it's so
Right, yeah.
constrained
No, it's an
that we're
interesting
just
idea.
like, okay, I'm so exhausted. I guess I'll watch some Netflix. Like
Yeah.
that's what I'm going to do with my leisure time, you know?
Yeah.
And that's such a sad excuse for leisure, you know?
Yes.
So I think our imagination could be enlarged. I think our imagination is really shrunk by how constrained our time is when we do have free time.
Yeah, it's another example of one of those things that's so like deeply ingrained in our minds that it's almost impossible to imagine alternatives.
Yeah.
And you know, also, you know, I think that what I'm getting from you in a sense is that it's not just about time so much, but about like what is being done in that work time. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, okay, let's say I only work 3 hours a day, but if you work 3 hours in a 3 hours a day in a dangerous factory
Right,
with
right.
a shitty boss,
Yeah.
you know, that harasses you and it's dangerous. You know, how is that solving
Yeah.
any problems?
Well-
You know what I mean? Like, and you still, well, I have 21 hours a day of free time, but you're still like kind of your ability to, it's that Chomsky thing again. It's like your ability to feed yourself rests upon kind of drawing resources from this shitty institution.
Yeah. So one thing I wrote about in the book was my father worked on oil rigs,
Uh-huh.
and he used to commute 9 hours from Wyoming to North Dakota, and he would work on the oil rigs there.
Drive 9 hours?
9 hours, and he would live in a man camp for like 2 weeks.
Wow.
That's what they're called, man camps. And basically he'd just work nonstop for 2 weeks. So then he would drive 9 hours back after that 2 weeks, and then he had like a week off or something.
Yeah.
But for the first 3 or 4 days, he was so exhausted he just slept, or he was really sick. So he was just like recovering from illness. Now that's
Jesus.
not like leisure time.
No, that's like
this is
recovering from almost
Yeah.
being killed.
Yeah.
That comes up in the documentary that's called I think with banners and babies, or with babies and banners. It's a documentary about the Flint sit-down strike and the Women's Emergency Brigade of 1936-37, and it's about like the women that got involved in the Flint sit-down strike that created the United Auto Workers Union at Flint, or in Flint, Michigan. But anyway, the in the documentary, the women all talk about that idea that like the men were coming back from the factory like just destroyed physically, and they were unable to really be anything of any use in the house, raising the kids, making dinner, all those things that like, and so in other words, it affected women like tremendously to have men basically ruined by industry, and come back, and they talked about this thing that's the pool room widow, like the men would basically have to drink booze to help their bodies feel better after working 14-hour shifts. They're like, one of the women talks about her husband's hands basically wouldn't work when he got home, and he couldn't like he couldn't grasp a fork to eat his meal, and it felt like in Kill Bill. I don't know if you said Kill Bill, but she's like, her fingers, Uma Thurman's fingers hurt so bad she can't use the chopsticks, and it's just such a tragic idea, and it really gives you the idea that what you're talking about with time is it's not just the time spent in the factory, right? It's like everything that comes with it.
Yeah. No, my dad's hand has pretty much been ruined. He plays a guitar, and his hand and this part right here is completely sunken. We don't know what's wrong with it because they never go to the doctor. But yeah, I mean, that's what I wrote about in the book. It's like time is not simply like clock time. It's about human development. Yeah. It's time for being and becoming. And so much of our human potential is sort of just destroyed by the conditions that we live in. So that's what I really, think is really depressing about prisons, right? And how prisons shorten lives, but you're also just sitting there doing nothing. Like there's nothing meaningful going on in prisons. Yeah.
And how much of it comes back to your body and mind being like stolen, essentially. Yeah. It's a theft. I mean, when I think about, I don't know if you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, but that movie for me was about slavery in some respects, but it was also about capitalism. It was about kind of how a system that is dependent upon human labor has to always exploit that human labor. And there's a scene where they're kind of, the slave owners are gathering all the slaves and basically questioning how much cotton they were able to pick all day, and how they turned the slaves against each other based on like how much they were producing. And it's a movie about it's specifically about slavery, but it goes to all the things you're talking about, and like kind of how the system, whatever it is, slavery, capitalism, however you conceive of that, is about kind of robbing people of their lives and robbing time specifically. What is the name of your book?
It's called Decolonizing Time, Work, Leisure, and Freedom.
I love it.
Of course, the joke is that someone close to me always says I cannot decolonize time myself. Like I'm very workaholic. So so there's maybe another reason I wrote the book. But,
Well, I think that's probably.
But I want to say, like, when you have a job where you have more discretionary time, which is the word I use in the book, rather than free time, because I think discretionary time is more meaningful. You're kind of lonely because everyone else is working all the time. Yes. Right. So that ultimately, until we change the sort of institutional structure of how much we work, and also the culture, it'll be very hard. That's why I really enjoy seeing old people, because they hang out a lot, and they spend a lot of time just hanging out and talking and having coffee and enjoying each other.
Yeah, they're experiencing time in a different way.
Yeah. So.
Well, we can all look forward to being
old. I look forward to retirement. Yeah, if that can happen. But of course, nowadays you'll be a Walmart greeter. I mean, and I think people go back to work not just simply because they need the money, but a lot of them just feel so isolated and alone after they quit working, because work is the center of our world in the United States. Yeah, I mean that's why a rearrangement of that is the starting point for beginning to have a larger conversation about how we draw meaning from our lives. Right? Is that thing about we're being kept from really having the time to explore and imagine different possibilities for ourselves. And that's kind of how the system keeps going in a lot of ways. Nichole Shippen, thank you so much for sitting down with me. I appreciate it. Thank you.